Good morning. I want to speak on integrity this morning. Within the Buddhist path, integrity is one of the most significant foundations that we need to understand and cultivate as a way of creating the container to be able to do the work of letting go. Certainly we can see that when we do something that we really regret, our mind is filled with turmoil, and the impact of our unskillful actions not only are affecting our own mind and our physiology and disturbing our sleep and causing us to stay up at night and to walk around feeling really distressed, but it also has a very significant impact on the world around us. And so our own ability to look and see clearly is directly connected to our capacity to live with integrity. When we live with integrity in a skillful way, then what happens is that our mind is not filled with remorse. We are able to focus and concentrate. We live with a peaceful heart without regret. We sleep well. We wake more rested. And all of those things are contributing to being able to notice what's going on in the present moment and responding to it in a way that is appropriate. So integrity is a significant foundation in the path of awakening. And integrity is a significant foundation when we're navigating trauma. One of the most significant things as we're working with and releasing traumas in our system is to create a context where we're safe. And when we are safe also means that we create a sense of safety for others. So integrity is significant. It's significant. It intersects with many different parts of the path, and so it's important to understand what it is, how to practice it, and to use it as a stepping stone in the path of awakening. So in the Buddhist tradition that I've come from, the 5 basic precepts is the standard to reflect on. And the precept of non-killing, of non-stealing, of refraining from sexual misconduct, of incorrect speech, and refraining from taking any substances which confuse and cause the mind to become unclear. So these basic 5 precepts are set as a container to reflect upon. They're not set as commandments. There's no sense that you have sinned or that there's a kind of a there's no, it's a deliberate thing that you take on board as a training principle to reflect on your own behavior. And certainly it is very useful to see the way elders and the Buddha speaks about any of these things, but there isn't a precept committee that tells you and determines for you the kind of nuances that need to be figured out in terms of what this means, in terms of how refined you are going to use this or work with this, and navigating all of the gray areas that it inevitably brings up in life when there's so many ethical questions that are not black and white. So it is to create a reflective container that gives us very clear parameters about edges and a way of navigating what is skillful and what is unskillful without making the gradations of the scale when we're navigating some of the more complex ethical issues that come up in life. So just to come back to the simplicity, the way the precepts were set up is behaviors to refrain from engaging in, to refrain from killing, to refrain from stealing, and to refrain from sexual misconduct and so forth. And there's a really valid point that if we live a life trying to do a don't, it's very different than if we focus on positive aspirations and actions that can motivate us towards something that we do want to do. So, point well taken. And there have been some teachers in some traditions that have reframed the precepts in terms of positive behaviors that we do want to aspire to. And Thich Nhat Hanh and the 5 mindfulness trainings is a beautiful example of that. And so I would encourage you to have a look at that and see if the languaging of that resonates and supports you to come forward with positive aspirations in the way that each of these restraining precepts is designed to support. Now, from my own experience, one of the things that's helped me a lot is to be able to not only look at the external container of the specific behaviors that I want to refrain from doing, but also to use this as a way of going inwardly and seeing the subtle kinds of habits of mind that I can use the precepts to help me reflect on. So when we look at the first precept, the refraining from killing any living being, you know, what this is talking about is not killing people, not deliberately killing animals. When, you know, I have a practice of catching flies and spiders, and if I don't want them in the house or where I'm staying, I put them in a container and I take them outside. I don't swat mosquitoes. I brush them off my skin. And all of this comes from really understanding the preciousness of life. Now, it's easy in our minds to think, well, a mosquito doesn't really have a lot of value, or, you know, when ants invade the house, there's so many of them and it's not that important. But when we really begin to start looking at that every living being wants to live, everyone, no matter how little, and no matter how irritating or annoying they are to us. And when we start living in a way that respects that, really taking care around that, it has a very positive impact on our own mind and our own ability to appreciate the real miracle of sentiency and the preciousness of life. So the external behavior is to refrain from killing any living being, no matter how small and no matter how insignificant. But when I use this precept as an internal reflection, so moving away from the classical way of creating a boundary around specific behaviors to avoid, but I use it as a way of looking at internal behaviors, then I see that the underlying principle behind this precept is the desire to refrain from doing any kind of harm. And when I look at my own personal experience and the way my own mind works, I can see that there are just many different ways in which I have habits of mind that are around harming myself, the way in which I can criticize myself or slander myself or shame myself or betray myself or abandon myself. And when I take this precept to refrain from killing and use it in the internal reflective way of refraining from harming, then one of the first things that I recognize is that I have got to wake up to the ways in which I harm myself and stop doing it. I have to. It's absolutely imperative. There is absolutely no way to move forward on this path unless one takes this seriously and stops hurting oneself. It's imperative. And because these patterns are very deep-rooted, then when I take the precepts and I use it to affirm this commitment to stop harming myself, it gives me some traction against these habits which are very deep-seated. The second precept, to refrain from stealing, is about not taking things that are not given. It's about not taking property that doesn't belong to you. It's about not taking or assuming that somebody is happy to give something when they're not. It's about being careful about copyright infringement and not copying CDs or music or movies without having permission to do so. It's about making sure that one declares the items in one's luggage and that one doesn't evade the immigration policies around what's okay and what's not okay to take in and how much taxes there are on bringing in certain goods. So it's all about that. And in many ways, in our contemporary world, this precept is one of the easier ones to break, because at the time of the Buddha, I don't think they had copyright infringement laws where we do. So on an external level, it's about understanding what belongs to us, what does not belong to us, and navigating that with grace and skill. You know, certainly, you know, on a retreat, the food is offered at the mealtime, but we don't go into the refrigerators at off hours and help ourselves to anything that's there. So, you know, principles like this. But as an internal reflection, the precept of refraining from stealing or taking what's not given really has to do, for me, with the mind that is constantly asking things to be different than the way that it is. You know, it's the if only mind. It's the if only my back didn't hurt. If only I slept well last night. If only I had a lot of energy right now. If only I wasn't feeling so sad. If only I wasn't feeling so scared. If only, if only, if only, if only, if only. And so when I use this precept to work with the internal experience, then what I can see is that it gives me pause every time my mind is moving into the if only things were different than the way they are, then I would be happy, or I would be able to practice, or I would feel content. And so it gives me an opportunity to pause another very deep-seated tendency. The third precept, refraining from unskillful or inappropriate sexual behavior, you know, in terms of the Buddha's definitions around that, it's not that complex. Inappropriate sexual behavior is having sexual activity or relationships with people who are underage, somebody who's in another committed relationship where there's not consent. There's nothing in the Buddhist precepts about same-sex partnership. There's nothing in the Buddhist precepts about those kinds of choices. So it's not about that. And certainly we can notice that in our complex world, there's an awful lot that's not very clearly delineated in just those simple guidelines. So there's a huge area of inquiry for all of us to come to a healthy relationship with our own sexuality and live it in a way where our sexuality is included in our practice. It's not separate from our practice. And it's something that furthers the heart and mind opening. And so that's a whole other conversation about what supports being integrous in our sexuality and allowing the heart and mind to open. I think what's really important in our contemporary world is that in addition to understanding we need to come into right relationship with our sexuality, I think we also need to come into right relationship with the whole world of sensuality. the way we relate to stuff and to things and to how we use them in order to bring about a sense of well-being and happiness for ourselves. In our world, in our increasingly densely populated world with all kinds of very significant issues around climate destabilization, around poverty, around who has enough and who doesn't have anywhere near enough to meet basic needs. It's not a frivolous conversation as to what we have and how we use it and what we do with stuff. So the whole world of sensuality needs to come into question. And in an internal way of relating to this, it isn't so much about the stuff that we have, but the way that we use sense contact in order to distract ourselves or to fill emotional needs, rather than just to be aware of sense contact as sense contact. So the fourth precept is the precept to refrain from incorrect speech. And in the 5 precepts, or in the 8 lifetime precepts, these include not lying, not speaking things that are frivolous, not being divisive, and not being slanderous. So not speaking what is untrue is really a whole commitment to being honest. And when you take this to heart, really wholeheartedly, it means, the kinds of jokes and jests and making things up in order to have a laugh. It's an interesting question whether that still serves a heart that's intent in moving in a truthful way. And so some of our speech patterns, even ones that are done for fun, they might be open for questioning. But certainly when we can notice that when we are exploding with anger in a way that is just blasting somebody, the harmful impact can be just devastating. It can take years, and sometimes it can, a whole relationship can be so completely blown out of the water that it never recovers. And so harsh speech, where there's an intent to harm somebody, an intent to really hurt them, there has got to be the willingness to see how damaging this is and to refrain from doing that. Divisive speech is to take people who are in harmony and to split them or to separate them or to sow seeds where there already is seeds of divisiveness, to speak in a way that encourages it, increases it. And so, it's a practice to not do that, to speak in a way that encourages people to trust one another rather than encourages them to distrust one another. Now, certainly, you can see that in this precept and that in every single, there's edges of this where we can use this in a way which is skillful, and we can also use it in a way that's not skillful. So sometimes there are people who it's wise not to trust them, but we can speak about that in a way that doesn't shame them as a human being and speaks about the qualities of their behavior that is not trustworthy. So there's truthful speech and harsh speech and divisive speech and then useless speech. And useless speech is really talking about stuff that has no value, no meaning, does not incline to depth, does not incline towards ease and well-being. And as an internal reflection, it's about really looking at the way in which we speak about things in our own mind. And then the 5th precept is around drugs and drink. And certainly there's all kinds of substances that we can get absorbed into. But the real problem with addiction is not the substances. The problem with addiction is the many different kinds of behaviors that cause ourselves to become distracted and confused. And so in the internal reflection of this, of looking at the precepts, the quality that we are interested in looking at is the way the mind is constantly moving into thinking any kind of addiction is based on the notion that there's happiness and satisfaction that's outside of the present moment, that it's in something. And so when we look at this as an internal reflection, we can see the movement of the mind towards wanting things to be, that somehow something needs to be different than the way it is in order for us to be happy. So altogether these create the reflections around integrity. And integrity is a tremendously significant aspect of the path.